if you found out you were being lied to? What if someone held back information? Would you accept it? Why lie? Are you ready for the truth? Shalom and welcome back. Today we're going to go over the halachot of Pesach in order to remind ourselves, since we are in the time of Pesach right now. This is Chol HaMoed. What is Chol HaMoed? It's the time period that's in between the two Shabbats. You have the Shabbat Rishon, which is the first day that we have, which is the day called Chag HaMatzot. Alright? And we have the Shabbat, which is the Achron, the last Sabbath, which this Sabbath that's coming up is in remembrance of our going through the Red Sea. This is the time period that we have in remembrance that we're learning about all these things. And to understand these things, we have to go through and remember why and what it is that we need to do, and to keep our hearts focused on what Pesach is all about, to keep our minds focused on what are the mitzvot, and also what are the things that are asur, okay? When we're dealing with issues of prohibitions, we're talking about things that are asur. It is prohibited to do these things, okay? So we want to know what's mutar, what is permitted, and what is asur, what is forbidden, okay? And in doing so, we want to keep our mind focused on the fact that this should always be within our hearts and understanding when it comes to making of what the Torah tells us is how to celebrate Pesach. So with this being, we're going to be covering a bunch of different subjects, all specifically in focus of Pesach, okay? And what better time to do it than in the time period when we are to be learning about Pesach itself, right? This is it. So, with that being said, let's begin. Adonai, Lord God, I pray, help us to stand in truth. Help us to walk in obedience to what the Torah says, which is to walk in righteousness. Help us to encourage others around us to walk in the truth of your commandments. Help us to fight against the lies of the enemy that tries to creep in, to come, and tries to come to deceive, and tries to twist and pervert and manipulate the minds. That righteousness alone would only be taught, and righteousness alone would only be kept, and that those things which are wrong would be destroyed, would be cast out, and would be considered as garbage. That we would Torah, we would keep the Torah, we would follow what the Torah says, we'd walk in the ways of Torah all the days of our life, to believe in Mashiach Yehoshua, first and foremost, the one who is and as always is the Mashiach in heaven. Amen. So, we need to understand there's halachot, alright, when it comes to anything that we're learning, alright? What is halachot? Halachot comes from the word halacha. Halacha in Hebrew comes from the meaning of halach, which means to walk. So when we're talking about what is the halacha, we're talking about what are the things that we are to do in the way we live in our daily manner. Some things are considered halachot of a moed, right? How do we keep at a certain appointed time? And what are we to do during that certain appointed time that we're not required to keep in a normal everyday basis? Since Pesach is a moed, it's a time period that you cannot keep it whenever you want to. You cannot observe it however you want to. It must be according to the rules and according to the chuchot, according to the Torot, okay? And these are the things, even according to the mishpatim, these are the things that we have to understand, okay? So, we have to understand what these things are. So let's kind of go through these things so that we can understand the halacha of Pesach. So halachot Pesach. So the halachot of Pesach, we're talking about the rules of Passover, how we're to observe and keep, what are we to follow and observe, okay? First we have the Torah. The Torah is the instructions that we learn from the Torah, which is how we are to observe certain things. And these are the things that tell us in relationship to what is it we're to do and what is it we're to be following. We have the Chuchot. This tells us the manner that we are to do things in, alright? And then we have the Mishpatim. These are the things that we have to do in relationship to preserving order in relationship to Pesach. So what does the Torah say? The Torah says, "Vayamad Adonai el Moshe," the Lord said unto Moshe, "Ve'el Aharon unto Aaron, be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt, le'emor, saying, Hachodesh hazeh, this month lechem is for you Rosh Hadashim," right? Rosh Hadashim. This Torah did not say Rosh HaChodeshim. The Torah says Rosh Hadashim. Why is it there's a difference? To say the month of months would mean that Pesach will fall at the beginning of the fiscal year. Okay? The Torah does not tell us this. The Torah says Rosh Hadashim means a head of months. So that means that Pesach, okay, according to the Torah, is the way we are to keep in relationship to the time period that's called the head of the festival months. Okay? So the Torah tells us that the Pesach, right? So Pesach must be the first of the festival months. Okay? Pesach is the first of the festival months. It is not the first of the year. It is the first of the festival months. The reason why most people screw up and they say that the Passover is the first of the year, and they think this is so, is because they're relating to the English translation. Okay? The English does not tell you the truth. Okay? Sorry. It does not tell you the truth. It doesn't say this is the first of the month. It says it is a what? Rosh Hadashim. A head of a month. Which means it is not the head of the month of the year. Okay? The month of Tishrei is the head of the month of the year. Okay? And we're going to understand this from the point of view that the halacha, alright, of Pesach, we have to understand why is this the case. Okay? If Passover, we're going to put up here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Alright? If Passover, I want you to realize why this would be a grave error if you did this, okay? If Passover was the head of the fiscal year, I want you to understand how this would be, okay? If Passover was the head of the fiscal year, alright, which would mean that we're considering the whole year starts at this point, alright, and begins and ends when the next month pops behind it, that would consider the end point. We have, if this was month number 1, okay, the head of the months, then we have at the end of 12 months, okay, we know that the lunar and the solar cycles don't collide with each other properly, okay? The lunar cycle's got 29.9 days, the solar cycle has 365 days, they don't mesh. So what happens is every 2 to 3 years, you have to add an extra month, okay? So here, you might have an extra 13th month, okay? This always has to fall, well, I should get into this thing because we'll go to the part, but I'll get in now. This has to fall, according to the Torah, always during the time of spring, okay? Which means that the frost has to come to an end so that spring can begin. And so this is something for you guys who don't go out there and plant. You don't understand why this is so significantly important because you're not a part of it. Most people 100 to 200 years ago would have been agriculturally inclined to know exactly what's going on. You would go back to Mashiach's day. Most people were agriculturally inclined, so they understood the parables that Mashiach said. When you think of today, most people don't have any agricultural connection. You have maybe a guy who does flowers now and then, maybe a guy who does a garden. Most people don't. And so we have to understand that this is where we have a big problem, okay? The time period by which it does happen, where we have to add an extra month, is because winter hasn't come to an end. It's too cold to go out and physically plant any plants, because if they were to grow, the night freeze could come in at a really cold temperature and then kill the plants. That's when we know that this is not spring yet. We have to wait till the time period where the last frost is not going to hit us anymore. And we have to follow the moon cycles, okay? So here, if we have, for example, a crescent moon, right? Which tells us this is getting towards the end of the month, right? Because we have two crescents. We have a crescent in the beginning and a crescent at the end. And when we see that crescent at the end, we're like, okay, this is coming to an end. But we realize it's still too cold. I mean, we're still getting, 30 degrees in the evening. And we know that the new month is kicking in about a couple of days. And we know that we still got some cold storms coming in, okay? We can identify by that, by the knowing of what the coldness is like at the end of the month, that, you know what, we're going to have to add an extra month, okay? So when this happens, we know that, okay, by the time that this cycle comes to an end over here, so when we get that nice little crescent, which we know that this is coming to the end of that month, which is at the end of the year, we then have to begin going and counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? Now here's the thing we have to understand, alright? And this is why it's important, okay? Is the fact that when we look at the time period of Passover, okay, why does Passover have to fall at a certain time? We have to realize that solar calendars don't follow the lunar calendar. Okay? Because the solar calendar doesn't follow the lunar calendar, we have a major problem that would take place. So let's look at this issue here, okay? This is the festival time period. This is not according to solar, remember? This is the festival. The solar and the lunar are colliding together at this time period, and you have only 2 times in the whole year where the sun directly hits the equinox. You have the spring equinox and you got the fall equinox. And that's basically right when it hits the equinox, we know that that point, when the sun hits that point, that we're at the point in position where we're going to be getting into spring or we're going to be getting into fall. Okay? When we're talking about the sun, okay, the sun does like this egg shape, of this 8 kind of like shape that goes back and forth, and this happens throughout the year when we're getting from winter all the way down to summer. So from winter to summer, there's a big fluctuation. When it's winter time, the sun's down lower. When it's summertime, the sun is much higher, and you can see this by going to Google and stuff. You'll find people have actually taken a picture every month to see exactly where the sun is using the same. And you'll find that this is what happens. The sun does this big loop back and forth because it's going up high and going down low because of the fact that the sun, which rotates around the earth, no, the earth does not rotate around the sun rotates around the earth, okay? And so when the sun's rotating around the earth, it's actually going and doing a little up and down motion, okay? It goes up here and goes down. While it's circling, it's like a spiral that goes here and goes back up and goes back down. And this is what we're seeing. When we're taking a picture, we're seeing that the sun is going around the earth doing the spiral motion. And at the stage of where it's at, if it's high, we know we're in the summertime because more heat is expressed upon the angle of the earth. When it's lower, we see that we have less heat, so therefore we're in the wintertime period. So we have to know the differentiation between the two. And so what happens is, this is the point where we have to understand, is when the sun is at the position that it has to be at for a new year to happen, because we also have two things that take place. We have the earth here, we got the moon, and way over here we got the sun, right? And the sun, way out in the far distance, it rotates and goes to the same position where it needs to be at to create a whole new year. And that's the whole 365-day rotational cycle around the earth, okay? So we're talking when the earth is at the absolute same point it needs to be at to recreate. And we know this because of this. There's a difference between what we see with the sun, just like what we see with the moon, okay? When the moon, for example, is at its closest point, we see the moon larger. It's facing closer to us when it's doing its rotation, because we know that when the moon, for example, rotates around the earth, what happens is the moon is doing this. It's pushing forward and it's pushing back. It's pushing forward and it's pushing back. And when it's doing this through a motion that we see, which is kind of a retrograde in a sense motion, though it's not really in itself. But the way it works, because we're not moving and things, what happens is we see that the moon is doing these kind of cycles around the earth. And so when the moon is doing these cycles around the earth, as the moon gets closer to the earth, we're going to see a larger moon, okay? And so as the moon is moving, see, since we only see one face of the moon, right? The moon looks like it's just going like this, forward and backwards, but really it's actually rotating in a motion that's circular around the earth. And it's moving in this kind of motion as we see around the earth, okay? So when we look at the sun, for example, here's the sun, all right? When the sun gets to the position, just like the moon has to get to its position, which is, we know by the fact of the shadows that the earth casts upon the moon, we can say, the moon is now its original position now. Now we're starting a new month, okay? With the sun, we know this based upon the fact that as the sun moves through the sky, there are certain constellations that the sun is moving through, and as it moves through the sky back to the similar point that it begins, we know that what's happening for us is also the same thing is taking place. When the sun is moving closer to us, we know that we're getting into the deep of summer. When the sun is moving away from us, we know we're getting into the deep of winter. That's how we can tell the deepness within the heat and the cool, okay? So when we're getting to the point where the sun's where it needs to be at the beginning point all over again, all right? That position and that point where the sun is at is indicating to us the fiscal year. So the moon can be somewhere in some position here, but the sun is at its origin place. So to calculate both, we have to follow the sun and the moon's movement in order to understand where we're at based upon the sun and the moon's movement. Based upon the sun, we're going to get what the seasons are. Based upon the moon, we're going to get the time period of the actual counting of the actual Hagim, okay? So the thing we have to understand, because of this problem with the sun, okay, is since the sun has a beginning portion, and that beginning portion actually falls on the 7th month. This is according to the actual fiscal, according to the Hagim, okay, the sun falls really on the 7th month. This is where Rosh Rosh Hashanah is. This is when we celebrate Rosh Hashanah. We're actually celebrating the beginning of the actual fiscal year. Okay? So I want you to follow me logically what takes place here. So you got the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, 11th, 12th, alright? 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, alright? So I want you to think about why we have to do this and what the logic is behind it. Since Rosh Chodesh of the 7th month is the beginning of the actual fiscal year, what happens when we have to add an extra month on the 12th? Now we have to make a 13th. You see here? What happens is we cannot put Passover like we would if we were using the fiscal year of Passover being the 1st with the 7th. Because what would happen is the 7th month would now become over here the 8th month. Because what would happen is when you're putting the time period of the solar cycle, which this really is the 1st, right? So I want you to think about this. Since the 7th month is really the 1st fiscal month, this is the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, right? We have a problem. Because notice this. According to the solar calendar, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th is really the time period we'd find for what? The first month of the actual Hagim. 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. Remember, we don't add months for the fiscal year. So you have a problem of this. If I was to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, then where would Passover fall? The answer would be Passover would start to fluctuate very weirdly. So, and you would have to constantly worry about this time period. So, in order to keep this as the 7th month, and it would always fall on the 7th month, okay? The way that this always falls on the 7th month, you have to make the fiscal year the 7th month. You have to make the festival year the 1st month. And that's so that the 1st month always causes the 7th month to be on the 7th month. It's not on the 8th month. Because if you did it the other way, you would actually have this now becomes the 8th month. And that's how it would get very confusing. So Hashem knew this. He told us that in order to not have to worry about this thing, we learn that the 7th month is the fiscal year, and the 1st month is the actual festival year. So we know that there's a distinction between the festival and the fiscal. That's why the Torah tells us here, in the issue of talking about the Rosh Chodesh, it says this should be Rosh Chodeshim, a head of months. So now we know that the actual Passover is just a head. It's not the head. It's not the actual beginning of the year. The actual beginning of the year is the 7th month. That's why it's called Rosh Hashanah. People thought, they call it Rosh Hashanah because they're saying, well, it's just the Jews trying to make it as if it's like it's the head of the year. And the actual answer is no. It actually is the head of the year. That's why it's actually called Rosh, head, Hashanah, of the year. So the head of the year is the 7th month. And the Bible tells us that that's when God actually created the Garden of Eden. He actually created the earth. He began on Rosh Hashanah. So everything began on Rosh Hashanah. So on the 6th day of the 7th month, which is the beginning of the cycle of the sun, okay, that was when man was created. Okay? And so on the 6th day of the 7th month, man also was kicked out of the garden because what the Nachasha did. So we have to understand that the Torah tells us Pesach must be the first of the festival months. But it is not the first of the fiscal year, okay? So notice, but it's not the first of the fiscal year. So we understand that Passover never is the first of the fiscal year. Never. It says, Rishon hu lechem, the first it is to you, lachat shehashana, of the months of the year. So notice, the reason why we have to understand this, that it's not the first of the year, is because the beginning of the Torah says, Rosh Chadashim. If it said Rosh HaChadashim, it would mean the head of the months. Then it would say, oh, it should be for you Chadshe Hashanah, the months of the year. So whoever translated the English translation was trying to grapple with understanding how come the second part of the sentence says of the months of the year, but the first part of the sentence says Rosh Chadashim. And that's because they didn't understand that the Torah was not telling them that this was the head of the months of the year on the fiscal side, but rather this was only the head of the months on the festival side. This is Dabru el kol adat Israel, speak unto all the congregation of Israel, Lamor, saying, Be'eser lechodesh hazeh, on the 10th of the month, yikahu lechem, they shall take for themselves each man a lamb, labeit avot, for the house of the fathers, say labait, a lamb for the house. So the Torah tells us that when there is an actual temple standing, okay, the requirement is this must be done, okay? So we have to understand that there are rules in relationship to temple and without a temple, okay? So here we're going to say here, without a temple and with the temple. Now why am I saying this? Because if you go to Vayikra chapter 17, God lays out all the laws at the end of, throughout the book of chapter 17 of Vayikra. The Shem tells us that when the tabernacle was erected, that all the services that were done in relationship to the Chagim were now going to be focals and pointed to the temple, okay? So the temple service was going to be where you were going to slaughter the lamb. The temple service was where you're going to be bringing the lamb. The temple was the place where the lamb blood was going to be spilled. All that stuff had to be done physically there at the temple. So that's just something that we have to understand, that when we're reading the Torah wants us to know that there is laws for a temple, which is what we're learning here, and laws without a temple. So laws for a temple, when we do have a temple, we have to understand that there needs to be, and I'm going to make this stuff smaller here so I can write more information down. We have to understand that there has to be, the lamb has to be picked by the 10th of the festival month of Aviv, okay? So number one, we're going to look at, this is only for the festival year. It's the head, okay? So the head is only for the festival year, not the fiscal year, okay? Number two, we're going to look at the fact that here the Bible tells us that on the 10th, the lamb must be picked and taken to its place of living. And this has to be taken for a 4-day time period. So notice, I want you to understand something. A lot of people get really crazy because they're just too focused on what they're seeing and what they're reading and not focused on the whole. We have to look at the whole. We have to understand this. This is where a lot of anti-Semitism comes into play, when people start thinking Jews are not keeping God's Torah. Look, they're not doing this, they're not keeping what the Torah says. These are all lies, okay? Number one, we have to understand, whenever there is a physical temple, that means that only when the temple's standing and when the temple is able to physically stand, because all of the abilities for it to exist are there, which means Arabs aren't trying to shoot people and kill people and get the temple not to be built. Okay? The world is not trying to blow up the temple and cause the temple to cease from existing. When the temple is able to physically be erected with peace and nobody's trying to cause any harm to our people, right? We have an obligation to perform these specific acts because it is required by the Torah to us that we are to do these things at these appointed times. So you have to consider the time period of when you have a temple, there's an appointed meeting taking place when the temple is erected. So when the temple is not erected, we don't have this obligation. It's not upon us. We're not sinning if we don't do these things. It's considered as if because of this situation exists or what it is, it's just a law book that's there only when the time exists. We have to understand that these are the things that you have to look at as the same standard that you have, for example, with regard to like a similarity of how you raise your kids. You would tell your kid, don't touch that knife, don't give him that knife, he's not allowed to be around that knife, he's only 4 years old. Are you kidding me? Right? That law exists as long as what? As long as he's young and unable to handle it, right? But once he is able to handle it, that law doesn't exist. But does it mean that law is done away with? Of course not. If you have another kid that's in the house and he's 4 years old, that law still stays applicable, right? So the Torah is like the same aspect of telling us that as long as certain things exist, the law is applicable. And so therefore, when these things exist where we have the ability to have a temple, the temple is able to stand, the temple is able to be built, then there's a requirement that this be done. So that means that there's something about the temple existing and this event happening that we are to do this because of something we are to learn in the time period when the temple is standing. That we don't have to necessarily know in the same manner when the temple is not standing. Because if I'm not physically doing this, sure, I know the law. I know what the law says, I know what the law teaches, but I'm not physically doing it. So therefore, there's a lack of application that's done that makes it not applicable to my needing to understand to the level that I would need when the temple's standing. Okay? And so therefore, I may understand, for example, why this is, or maybe what this is about to an extent, okay? But when I'm living in a time period when the temple's standing, there's an awareness that's even greater that we have to know as Jews as to why is it we're to perform this. Okay? So one thing we have to understand this too is, number one, the festival year is the head of the years for festivals, and this is required by Torah law. Who are the ones that dictate when the festival year is coming to full fruition? The answer is the Sanhedrin. They're the ones who are going to depict the fact of this is the head of the festival year, and this is going to depict the fact of these events taking place when we live at a time period when there's a Sanhedrin. The answer why we understand this is because the Torah says that Aaron and Moshe were both Sanhedrin members. They were the ones who were the heads of the people. They were to tell the people when the head of the month was to exist. So many people fight and they say, well, Judaism uses a fixed calendar today. Well, that's because the Sanhedrin, before it perished and died, gave us the fixed calendar so that we would celebrate these things based upon that same time period, okay? But when the Sanhedrin is put back into position, when we have an existing Sanhedrin in today's time period, that calendar will disappear and it will require the Sanhedrin to indicate the head of the months of the year and the fiscal months of the year and the festival months of the year. You have to understand this, okay? So that should answer that question there when people try to throw that statement out, because there's just a lack of education here that they don't understand that it's the Sanhedrin that does have to indicate these things. So you have a lot of people like that go after Nehemiah Gordon and all these other guys out there, and they're trying to say, oh, we're going to make our own calendar up, we're going to make our own time period up and stuff. They don't understand that the actual Torah teaches us that when it says in Aaron and Moshe, is referring to two Sanhedrin members who are the ones who indicate these things, that this is the time period when the months begin for the festival time period of Pesach. And this has to be done when a Sanhedrin is standing. So when we don't have a Sanhedrin standing, we don't have to worry about this issue. We can use the actual fixed calendar that was given to us because the Sanhedrin was the one that gave us the fixed calendar to utilize. Okay? So we have to understand here. So the Torah goes to say, Yekahu Isay. So say is, once we have to understand this, we see that the 10th has to be a lamb. So here it has to be a yearling, and it has to be a male. And once again, it has to be a lamb. Okay? Now, we'll go into this as we continue on. So it says, Lebeit avot, for the house of the fathers. Say lebeit, a house, a lamb for the house. So once again, the lamb was for the household. Alright? So that means multiple people could be applied to the lamb. So we have to understand something here in relationship to this. Are women required to be a part of this? The answer is simply no. Why? Nida. That's the big reason. If a woman's nida, she is considered unclean and unfit to eat the physical lamb. So we have to understand that this is actually here, this is an obligation that are only upon the males. Okay? It's not an obligation upon women. A woman could at any moment, at any time, become nida for whatever reason. So therefore, it is prohibited, okay, for a woman, okay, to sit there and to think that she is required to be a part of this. She's not required to be a part of this. Only because the fact is she could become nida at any point. It's a male thing that we have to understand. So it's a male requirement. Okay? If she would want to, and she says, okay, I'm doing good, but then she finds out she's not, this is why we have to understand that there's a lot of complexities of this issue here, okay? Because if the woman could not be a part of it because of her being temeh, then what happens to the lamb, the designation and stuff? So the Torah makes this really, it's a requirement for the males in the household. And therefore this is why it says here in the Torah says, Lebeit avot, for the house of the fathers. So we're talking about literally son, father, son issue here, okay? It says, Imima tabayit, if the house will be too small, mihiyot, from being meseh, from the lamb, lekachu, he shall take he shekano, hakarov, those who are dwelling next to him, El Beito, to his house, Mimis Parat, Nafshashot, according to the number of the souls. So now we know that if the house is not enough people, like let's say the house got 3 people in it, the lamb's obviously big enough to feed more than that, then the requirement is to go and seek others who would join you that are near to you. So we have an understanding that basically the Torah is telling us that we should be living in close quarters with each other. This is why you have to understand this. In Egypt, in Galut, Israel lived in close quarters to each other. They lived in neighborhoods, they lived in communities and stuff. And this is where we find the fact that from the Torah itself, it teaches us that Jews lived in communities. Okay? It's not a shock. That's why you can sit there and say, wow, there's a community in New York, there's a community in Bnei Brak, there's a community over here in these different areas in Orlando or whatever and stuff. And therefore you know that this is because it's a requirement as Jews. If I'm going to be keeping Shabbat, I have to be able to walk to the shul because I can't drive to the shul. I have to be in close quarters to the place where I'm living at because I'm not allowed to walk beyond 2,000 amot if I have no roof. So these are the things we have to understand as to why we have to follow these standards and stuff. And majority of these things I want you to understand is that these laws right now that I'm just speaking to you in relationship to Passover only applies to the Jew at this point. Because here we have to understand that only those who are part of the covenant are required to bring the lamb, who are required to set the lamb apart from the 10th until the 14th, who are required to have the household males be a part of this. These are only an obligation that's placed upon those who are part of the Mosaic covenant. Okay? This is not placed upon Gentiles. Gentiles, the only obligation they're going to have is that they are at the Seder, which is to eat the bitter herbs, to eat the unleavened bread, and to be a part of the partaking of the remembering of our going forth out of Egypt. And of course, there is a separate thing that they can have, which is just a meal that both Jews and Gentiles are able to eat. But the Passover lamb, this specifically is only for those that are part of the covenant. So the Torah says, as we go on here, it says, Ish lepiachlu, each man according to his eating, ta kosu, you shall count al haseh, over the lamb. Say tamim, a lamb that must be perfect, zachar ben shana, the first year, So there has to be no blemishes in the lamb. The lamb has to be both internally and externally without blemish. Lechem should be min hakevesim, from the lamb, min ha'ezim, and from the goats tichachu you shall take. Now, notice the Torah gives you an obligation of eating from a male that is without blemish, without spot, perfect from the inside and outside. But then there is this from the lambs or from the goats. Now, you have to understand this is a choice that you have to make. Which one were you going to choose? Are you going to choose a goat for your Passover, or are you going to choose a lamb for your Passover? So this is a choice here in this Torah statement here we find. So the Torah says, "V'haya lechem lemishmeret," and it should be for you for a guarding ad arba asar yom. So you have to guard the lamb from the 10th until the 14th. You have to guard and protect it so that nothing would happen to it. Alright? The Torah goes on to say, Lachodesh hazeh, for this month, shachtu oto, they shall slaughter it, kol kahal adat Israel, all of the congregation of the gathering of Israel. So this is referring only to the Jews, as we see here, they're to slaughter it. Ben arbaim, at the afternoon. So the time of slaughtering has to be in the afternoon. So this is required. Ben arbaim is the afternoon in Torah. And the Torah goes to say, Lakachu min hadam, they shall take from the blood, natanu al shtei mazazot. Now this thing here, when we're learning about the blood that's being put upon the lintels and the doorpost, this was not a requirement that existed outside of Mitzrayim. So we have to understand that this issue was considered a one-time event. This was done only in Mitzrayim. This was done only at the place of the dwelling. And the reason why was because the Egyptians considered it an abomination to slaughter animals outside the homes. And so in order to facilitate what they permitted, because we see when Yosef was dwelling in Mitzrayim, the Bible tells us that he ate meat, and he was able to do it because he was doing it inside of his house. The Egyptians didn't care what you did inside your house, but if you did it outside your house, it was considered sacrilege. So they had an attitude of accepting that people had their own beliefs, and people had their own ideas. That's how the Egyptians viewed it. And so as long as you did it in your home, they didn't care. But if you did it outside your home, that's when they hussed and fussed. So that's why the requirement was they had to do it inside the house, was because of this issue. And the Torah gives the biblical requirement of how they were going to do it based upon the parameters of what Hashem said he wanted them to be done. So it says, Natana al shtei mezuzot, you shall place upon the two doorposts, va'al mashkof, and upon the lintels, al habaytim, over the houses, asher yichlu oto, which they will eat it, ba, in them. So they had to eat the lamb in them. So that's the other thing too. This is va'alchu et habasar, and they shall eat the flesh balayla, at night. Halazeh tzli esh matzot al morim. So they had to eat the lamb that's roasted with fire, and the matzot al morim, over bitter herbs. Okay? So another thing is, the Torah teaches us that the lamb had to be roasted in fire. And the people had to eat it inside the house. So we know, and then they had to eat it with matzah, so unleavened bread. With bitter herbs. Now when the Torah says, with regard to the matzot, as it says here, it says, umatzot al morim, and matzah over the bitter herbs. That means the bitter herbs and the matzah had to be encased. So the bitter herbs had to be eaten as a sandwich with the matzah above and below it. Yachluhu, shall they eat it. So the prohibition was we weren't in any way, shape, or form to eat the matzah and the bitter herbs, just bitter herbs and matzah together. You had to have matzah on both the top and the bottom and eat the bitter herbs in between. That is the halacha for eating it. And the Torah goes to say on here, Al tachlu mimenu na, you shall not eat from it, bashal mi bashal b'mayim, whatever that which is boiled in water. Okay? So there's a prohibition here that we see here, which is the mishpat, that you could not cook it in water. Okay? So the lamb was prohibited to be cooked in water. The Torah goes on to say, Im ki'im, rather tzli eish, roasted a fire, rosho, its head, al karav, over its legs. So the karav is the actual upper leg area, okay? It's where they leap and do all the movements from. So when it says here, its head over its legs, it means that the head had to be over and the legs had to be underneath it, okay? And the Torah says, al kirbor, over its innards, okay? So the innards had to be also roasted inside the lamb as well. Lo tutirun, you should not leave over mimenu from it ad boker. Hanoter mimenu ad boker, whatever is fermented from boker, be'esh tisarfu, in fire shall be burned. So you're not allowed to leave it until morning. So no lamb is to be left until morning. What is the judgment if it is? The Torah says here, burned in fire. So that is the prohibition. You're not allowed to roast the lamb in water, and you're not allowed to leave the lamb to be left, whatever you did not eat, until morning. And that the prohibition tells us that whatever is has to be burned in fire. Kacha tachlu oto, thus shall you eat it. So here's the obligation now. Shall you eat it? Matnechem chagarim, your loins shall be girded. Okay? So here's another rule we have here. Okay? I'm just going to drop it down here. Loins girded. According to Torah, the loin is here. It's from the lower cade of your rib all the way down to your hip. Okay, so your loins had to be girded. It says here, Nalecha baraglechem, your shoes on your feet. So shoes on your feet. Mekalchem beyadechem, your staff in your hand. So once again, staff in your hand. V'chaltem yishidit oto b'chitzfon, and you shall eat it in haste. Okay? So the actual Torah tells us that we're to eat the actual thing in haste because of what? Because the Torah teaches us that we're not to sit here. It's not going to be like the attitude that a lot of people portray it, like, oh, we're supposed to just have this like big humongous party, we're just chillaxed, we're laying back, we're just relaxing and chilling. The Torah tells us this on purpose because of what it is that we are to learn from this and what it is that we're to get understanding of this, which has to do with something always in the future. So we don't question the Torah when the Torah starts telling us that this is what we're to do. The Torah tells us that this is how we are to be, this is the status that we're to have when we're doing it. Whether or not anything happens that night is not at all in relationship to whether we should stop doing it or not, but rather we do it because we're commanded. So the Torah says here, Pesach ul Adonai, a festival is the Lord. Avarta, so once again, eat in haste. So eat in haste is the attitude. You're not going to take your time just trying to chill and stuff like that. You take your job serious with the fact of you eating. You take it serious with the fact of what you're doing. You're not just, spending your time just whatever. Because you have to always, the Bible is telling us to be in a state that is aware that something could possibly exist. Okay? Vavarti be'eretz Mitzrayim, and I crossed over the land of Egypt, Balayla at night, Hazeh, Hikati kol bachor, and smote all the firstborn, be'eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt, mi'adam ad behemah, from Adam unto beast, b'chol Elohim Mitzrayim, and all against all the gods of Egypt, Aseh mishaftim Adonai. And this says, I will do judgment. So he says, he is the Lord. God says he is God, and that he is going to be shown that his way is the way that is to be kept. And so he's judging the world, as we see here in Mitzrayim, because of their not observing the true path. And so by doing so, he killed the firstborn. What do you mean he killed the firstborn of Egypt? So we have to understand what he means when he said he killed the firstborn of Egypt. He's talking about killing those who rose up first in their heart to rebel against God. Okay? So the people in Egypt who are very hardened towards God's commandments, who are the instigators of rebellion, God killed them first. That's what the Torah says. Alright? And so, why did he do this? He says because he wanted to make it known that his ways are the right ways and that no one's going to mess with God. You understand? So here's these guys, they're like the weeds of life that rise up, that try to instigate people to rebel and do sin. And God says, okay, he's going to hew them down. He's going to say, now, any questions? Do you guys want to continue going down this path of destruction? Do you want to go on this path anymore? Is this the right path you want to follow? That's what he did when he killed all the firstborn of Egypt. It was to prove the point that these people had done nothing but destroy the path of the people from listening to what they should have. Because remember, he spent, before the firstborn plague happened, he spent 9 plagues trying to get the whole people of Egypt to repent and do teshuvah. And refusing were the people to do that teshuvah, because they sat there and began convincing themselves with the ways and the ideas that they created in their own heart of how they were going to look at things in life. So what did the Torah say here? The Torah says here that God killed the firstborn of Egypt to make the point that he's not playing around. That he wants to get people to do teshuvah and repent and do what's right. And so we have to see and understand that this is very much an important thing for us to hold on to and understand. And it says, V'haya hadam lechem, and the blood shall be for you, la'ot al habaytim, a sign. So the sign that existed as the blood, as he says here, was a symbol for the people physically to see in their homes during the time period of Pesach. So this is why we know that this is not an event of putting the blood on the doorpost and on the lintels today. This only exists because where does the blood go now? The Bible says when you go to the temple, you take the blood of the lamb and it's poured upon the altar. And therefore the blood's poured upon the altar inside the actual temple area, and then the lamb, which has no blood in it, you would be taking to the houses that you'd be eating, which is in Jerusalem, and there in a place you'd be roasting the lamb, and the people who are there would be gathered with you, who are going to eat the lamb with you, and only those who are designated for lamb would be the ones eating the lamb with you and stuff. Okay? So the Torah goes on to say, as we continue on, it says, Ra'iti, he says, I will see the blood, Pasachti aleichem, I'll cross over for you, Lo yihi bechem negef, there will not be a plague in Negev, Mashachit, of destruction, Bahakoti, when I smite Beretz Mitzrayim in the land of Egypt. Va'yah hayom hazen, it will be on this day, lechem for you, lezikron, for a what? A remembrance. So the Torah is actually telling us that what happened here in Egypt is actually going to be for us a place of remembering that we need to keep deep in our heart. I don't like how people have seen it in their Bibles. It says for a memorial. It's a really stupid thing, because people think of memorial, they think of, oh yeah, remember we saw that statue over there. It's just to remind the people, all the people that died. But they don't take it like the way the Bible's pointing it as. The Bible's telling us that this is to remember what happened and to keep into remembrance of what's happened, even for the future, not for the past. You see, memorials are stuff we think of what happened in the past. Oh, that was horrible. What those guys went through were horrible. To remember what happened in the past. It doesn't really focus upon what we should do for the future. If you think about it, it really doesn't have that same effect. The attitude the Bible's giving us is for the future. To remember what happened in the past so we can look at things in the future, and our mind is putting, oh, I remember what the Torah said with relation to these different things. And I know people might sit there and say they disagree and stuff, okay? People might sit there and say, what do you mean? Like, the Vietnam Memorial and stuff like that. Like, I would beg to ask the question, like, what does it really show in relationship to the future? One thing we can see in relationship to what's happened is definitely we can see that it showed that we failed miserably with the fact of how many people died and suffered. And it was made in order to memorialize those who were in the war and they fought and died. But does it really tell us to stop the things that caused the problems or what led to what took place to it? I would have to say it really doesn't, and that's the thing we have to understand. Okay? Because when we're looking at this, what the Torah wants us to see here, it wants us to look at something to be mindful of the future. That's what the Torah is, that's what Zikaron is all about. It's about keeping as a remembrance. So as the Torah continues on to say, the Torah goes to say, Uchagatem, you shall celebrate it. So here's another mitzvah, right? We are to celebrate the Passover, right? You shall celebrate it, as the Torah says, Uchagatem oto, and you shall celebrate it, Chag l'Adonai, as a festival to the Lord. So we have to celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. So this is where we're going to understand that Jews and Gentiles have an obligation to celebrate Passover. Why do they have an obligation to celebrate Passover? We have an obligation because the Torah is telling us that as Pharaoh, which is a picture of Hasatan, who has been a dictator against all of us human beings, both Jews and Gentiles, it is through Mashiach Yehoshua that we are set free from the spiritual captivity of Hasatan, even though we're not physically set free from things yet. We know that when Mashiach returns, we will absolutely be given that freedom, because that is when we're going to be leaving what's called Galut. Alright? And so the Torah tells us this, that we're to celebrate it to the Lord. So that means the Gentile, when he comes to believe Mashiach, we're to draw him in to sit down and celebrate Passover with him, because just as he has been delivered from his lack of understanding of what Mashiach is and his lack of understanding of what God is, his celebration is with us, because we are seeing that God has delivered both Jews and Gentiles, and Passover is the time period of that deliverance. It is a remembrance of what Mashiach did for us. It's a remembrance of the things that we've done, and it's to remember of what is to come too as well. And that's something we have to understand this, because we're not sitting there going that Passover is just a memorial, because we have not been physically delivered from our Mitzrayim, have we? So therefore we're still looking at it as this is a remembrance of what is to come. So it's not just, yes, I'm thankful for what Mashiach did then, it's I'm thankful for what Mashiach is going to do also when he comes back and we get the full-fledged deliverance when he returns. And this is the thing that we are to understand when it comes to this. That's why it says, Chogatem oto chag l'Adonai l'doratechem, throughout your generations. Chochat olam, it is a statute forever. Tachokuhu, that you shall celebrate it. So we are required by Torah law to forever celebrate Passover. This is an eternal decree. You cannot in any way, shape, or form deviate from this. Okay? Celebrate it. Here's the word, forever. So notice that the Torah tells us that Jews and Gentiles are to celebrate Passover forever. So what is the problem that we have with relationship to Jews who are not studying the Torah properly to understand that Gentiles are to be a part of this? Is the fact that A, they try to convert Gentiles to become a part of them, and then try to say, now you're obligated to keep these things, when it's because they don't want to believe. In their mind, this is the struggle that exists, is the fact that Messiah is the hope of the world. Mashiach Yehoshua is the hope of the world, and therefore it's because of what Mashiach Yehoshua did that both Jews and Gentiles, we are both saved. Okay? And there's a lack of understanding in this. And that lack of understanding is the fact that when we're looking at this thing here, God never required Gentiles to become a part of the Mosaic covenant. And the Torah makes it very abundantly clear that this is not an obligation. It's a choice issue. If you desire and you wanted to, it had to come from your own free will, not because you felt obligated, not because you felt pressured, not because you felt like you were not going to be a special person if you didn't. It was because you wanted to and because you want to be a part. And notice this, when the Torah speaks in relationship to the fact of the celebration of Pesach, it's being delivered from bondage. So therefore, when Jews see these things, they don't understand that when the Torah talks about Gentiles coming to believe in God, that they are being delivered from bondage. And how do Gentiles come to believe in God? It's through Mashiach. That's why we know that this is the big thing. Because what did Mashiach Yosher say in the book of Yochanan? He said that now is the time when the Son of Man will be lifted up and all the Gentiles will come finally. The Gentiles, the masses of Gentiles will now come finally, and they're now going to see what it is that they have needed, which is this hope of their salvation, the hope of eternal life. Because remember, the nations and stuff, they live in their world, they live in their mentality, they live in their religious beliefs, but their religious belief is not telling them that they're sinners. The religious belief is not telling them that they need salvation, that they need God's forgiveness, they need God's atonement. And so when a Gentile comes to believe in God, it's because he's first coming to see that he's a sinner and he needs that salvation. And that salvation is why we're celebrating Passover, is because it's the hope that we have Mashiach Yehoshua, who came into the world, that God's Word came into the world, abided in the flesh, was crucified and killed and murdered, placed upon a tree, so that our sins would be imputed upon him, though he was made guilty for nothing. There was nothing he committed wrong, but it was really our wrongs that were placed upon him. And he took upon it, as the Bible says that Mashiach Yehoshua willfully laid down his life. He never said any man took it. He said he laid down his life for us. He let people accuse him of wrong crimes. He let people accuse him for lies and for deceitful things that they made up in order to atone us, in order to bring forgiveness for us and to give atonement to us. And therefore, that's what draws people to God. That's what draws Gentiles to God, is when they see that God loves them, they see that God cares for them, and that God wants them to be forgiven and atoned. And the Bible goes on to say, as we continue on here, it tells us that you shall celebrate it. Shavat yamim matzot tachlu. For 7 days you shall eat matzah. So here's another thing. 7 days eating matzah. So 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Alright? Shavat yimim matzot tachlu, 7 days you shall eat bread. Ach b'yom harishon, from the first day, tashivitu, you shall see sa'ur. So what is sa'ur? Sa'ur are leavening agents. Okay, now here's a horrible thing we have to deal with in English, because English is a horrible language. I hate English beyond measure. I really do. Even though I speak it, I hate it. Because there's so many words that exist in the English language that are so deceptive. Okay? I'll give you an example of this. If any of you guys out there were ever to purchase something like, for example, consomme, alright? This is an actual soup making mixture, okay? You'll see it on here. It says kosher for Passover. Alright? Now in the back of this, it tells you a really ridiculous statement. It says here, ingredients: salt, potato starch, monosodium glutamate, sugar, vegetable oils, palm, coconut, dextrose, dehydrated onions, dehydrated celery, and then the word yeast extract. Try to get this in here so I can get it clean. There you go. Yeast extract. You see that word, yeast extract? Guys, there is no yeast in this. You got to understand this, okay? What's really horrible about the English language is that we have stupid words like this that confuse our brain. When a person says, wait a second, the Bible says you shall not have no yeast, right? The yeast that the Bible's speaking about is the yeast that causes bread to leaven. For example, if I stick flour and I put water and I mix it together, there is going to be a leavening agent that will exist if I leave it over time and the thing gets warm enough and starts doing it. It takes about 18 minutes for actual flour to become leavening, at the state of leavening, okay? The ancient days, leavening was made. You put flour, water, mix it together, add a little bit of more sugar to excite the thing if you wanted to. You didn't have to. You just put flour and water itself. You put it in the thing and put a little cloth on top, and the air would just constantly be flowing inside that jar, and you would find a nice bubbly thing within 7 days. It's just great for making, what's the word? My favorite bread too. I can't even think about it. Sourdough bread, okay? Can't even think about it now. My wife has to tell me. I like this. Sourdough bread, okay? So we have to understand, why on earth did this saying, the stupid thing say yeast extract? Okay, first off, what it should have said is, instead of yeast extract, it should have said fermented things. Yeast is not the same thing as we're talking about when we're talking about the sa'ur, okay? The sa'ur that's used here is relating to the things that will cause flour, once you mix water with it, to make bread leavened, okay? So there are things, for example, like grape husks. Grape husks is a form of a leavening agent for flour when you mix it with water to create sourdough bread, okay? There are other things out there that don't have this ability. And so those things have a fermentation that exists, and they can be used for different things, but they do not affect the actual baking of bread. So this thing here, all scary as it sounds, because you see the word yeast is referring to not yeast, but it's referring to fermented different items. And these fermented items are the things that actually are used for flavoring and different elements. So I want you to understand this. When we're talking about yeast, we're talking about the main yeast that you would see used over and over again, that's used for baking, that's used for making bread, such as your Arm & Hammer sodium, baking soda, baking powder, your leaven that you get at the store, just mixing spelt, rye, wheat, barley, oats with water and letting it sit, that creates leavening, okay? So this is not what it sounds. That's the sad part. So this is why when people freak out, they said, how could they have a hechsher on this? How could it say kosher for Passover? It's got yeast in it. No, it doesn't, okay? So to me, I have to say this, I'm sorry, but I think these people are retarded that write these words. I think they are, because they're not thinking about these words. Okay, they're not thinking about how they affect people. Okay, they're not thinking about the way they're putting these things out, because it causes people to think what it's really not. Okay, and I know it may sound like a very intense word when I say retarded, but I'm telling you, some people out there, they just don't think through things. They don't sit there and say, hey, did we just scare off half the group of people with words that don't really mean what they sound like? Because that's the problem. I mean, there are people out there, their brain just doesn't think about what they're putting down. And there's a lot of dumb English words out there that just don't even follow the pattern of what it is that it really is. And this is when you got to go and do that little research where you're like, well, what is yeast extract, and what is this, and what is that? And you start going through all these different words, you're like, why do they use that word? And the answer is, it's not the right word. It's not. You could say fermented products, fine, no problem with that. When you talk about yeast, let's talk about the stuff that it should be. You should be differentiating the difference between things that are used to make bread to rise versus things that create flavoring and other things but have no effective connection or even ability to affect flour and water mixed together to create bread. Okay? So listen, this is my way of speaking. I'm very aggressive with these things. I can't stand when people make these kind of errors because it screws people up. It's just like for a person. For example, I was reading this dictionary about Brown, Driver, and Briggs. They wrote the word veil, all right? And I was like, veil? That's like a whole head covering thing, all right? But see, back in the old English days, there were two meanings for veil. But you see, when you're a person who lives in the 1800s and you wrote that definition down, you'd say, well, wouldn't somebody think that this would be a covering over the face? And the guy should have said, well, let's just call it a head covering. Let's call it a scarf or a turban, female turban, whatever it is. It's sad, but that's how people are. They just don't think through what they do, and they just write words that just screw up people's thinking and gets people all freaked out over it. So If you do see the word yeast extract and you see a kashrut symbol on it, I'm going to tell you something here. You can calm down. It's not going to be something to freak out over. They're talking about fermented different types of things that they're used in order to create flavoring. It has nothing to do with leavening whatsoever. Okay? So just be in mind of that. So that being said, let's continue on. Okay? So the Torah tells us to eat it for 7 days. And the Torah tells us that it must cease from our house the Se'ur. So Se'ur can no longer exist in the house during this time period. So that means we have to be very careful when we're making matzah during this whole week, all right, that none of it has an ability to become chametz. Okay? And that nothing has the ability to become Se'ur, right? Because Se'ur is kind of a process. You kind of have to let it sit there, and it's kind of have to be in the water for a while and stuff like that. But if you're making your flour and you're making your dough real quick to make your matzah, it's easy to just take the stuff, flush it down the sink, and poof, it's gone. It won't become anything in your home whatsoever, okay? As the Torah says here, it says, Mi beitecha, from your houses, right? So does God care if it becomes fermented inside the gutters? No. He says, Mi beitechem, right? Does he become worried if it becomes, Se'ur down the street inside your system? No, it doesn't matter. What happens is, Mi beitechem, from your houses. Ki kol ochel chametz, for whoever is eating chametz, nikrata hanefesh hahi, that soul should be cut off. So it is considered a serious crime to eat chametz. So you're eating any form of leavening bread during Pesach, God says that if you do it willfully, you'll be cut off. Mi-Israel, miyom harishon ad yom hashvi'i, so the first into the 7th day. Biyom harishon, on the first day, mikrei kodesh, is a holy convocation. So we have to treat the first day of Passover as a Shabbat. And the only differentiation between a Hag versus a Shabbat is on a Hag, you can prepare food. You can actually cook with the flame, which means the flame actually is made beforehand, but you can cook with the flame. Where on Shabbat, normally you can't. If the Passover falls in a Shabbat, you can't. You can't cook with the flame. You can't do these things. The only thing you can do with relationship to the Shabbat with regard to Passover is if the temple is standing, we have an obligation to roast the lamb in fire. So therefore, it overrides the Sabbath. This is considered one of those exceptions to the rules. You cannot light fire on Shabbat. However, if the Passover falls on a Shabbat, you can do so. That's what the Torah is telling us. So the Torah goes on to continue saying that Mikrei Kodesh b'yom hashvi'i Mikrei Kodesh yihi lechem shall be for you kol malacha lo yaseh, you should not do on it. This is where we get the exception to the rule. This is why we know we can actually prepare food on Sabbath for Passover. It says, but that much may be eaten. So if we're going to eat something, lechol nefesh, for any soul who it is, lavado itself, yisei lechem, should do for you. So we know that we can actually cook things during a Hag. Hags are different than a Shabbat. Okay, so if I had my little grill outside, and I had an ability to take my things and have it cooking and ready and burning and stuff, I can actually roast, chicken and turkey and stuff. I can do these things during the Hag. Because why? Because the Hag lets me prepare food. It doesn't hold me like it normally does with Shabbat. Shabbat, you have to make food beforehand, and everything that you made is what you eat. With a Hag, you can actually make food on the Hag, as long as you have these things turned on. So like if you have a stove, like for example, I turn my back burners on during the Hag, I leave it at a 5, so it's at a good state where it's not too hot, it's not too cold and stuff, and you leave the burner on at 5 and you cook on it, okay? So when the Hag's over, turn the burner off, there you go. So if you got little ones and stuff, be in mind, use the back burners, they'll keep your hands away from it and stuff like that, but you can at least heat stuff up, you can warm things, you can cook things during the time period. However, if it's on a Shabbat, you cannot do it. So you have to hold on to the rules of Shabbat the same way as you do during every Shabbat if the Hag falls on a Shabbat. The only exception to the rule is if you have the temple standing, you go to the temple area, you brought your lamb, you have to roast the lamb in fire, so therefore only during that Shabbat scenario could you roast it legally and permissibly. But what would you do? You would do everything to try to get the fire started before Shabbat. So it's kind of like it's like, make it as simple as possible for yourself. So it's like you don't have to do so much. So the Torah goes on to say that you're to do this biyom hashvi'i, on the first day, and on the seventh day, Mikrei Chodesh Lihi Lechem, Kol Melech Lo Yaseh Behem, Ach Asher Yachel Kol Nefeshu Lavado Yaseh Lechem. Ushamartem et hamatzot, you should guard the matzot, Ki be'etzem hayom hazeh, for on this day, Chotziti et Tzevotech, bringing forth your host, merits between from the land of Egypt. Ushamartem et hayom hazeh, you should guard this day, Lodorotech, throughout your generations, Lochuchat Olam. So why do you have to guard the matzah? Because you have to make the matzah quickly. And if you want to know how to make matzah, please watch my video. I show you how to make matzot, so you can learn how to make matzot. The best thing to do is to get the different things like semolina, the flour, be able to use. I got this during Passover a few years ago, and it works great. All you have to do is go to a restaurant place, and they'll give you a nice little rolly thing, and you can prick all the holes inside your matzah, so that it has it, because the obligation and requirement to do so. So you just want to make sure that these things are done and that you have these things taken care of in this manner, so that you're keeping the actual halacha of Pesach. All right. So the Torah goes on to say that you should guard the matzot b'yitzim hazeh, hotziti meretz Mitzrayim, from the land of Egypt, and bringing forth your host. He says, Ushamartem hayom hazeh ledorotechem, throughout your generations, chuchat olam. It is a statute forever. It's an eternal decree. Okay. B'yom rishon ba'arba asar yom l'chodesh, on the 14th of the month, be'erev, at evening, tochlu matzot, you shall eat matzot. So we know that the actual Hag begins at evening on the 14th. So that literally means, okay, if you counted the calendar today, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and let's say the 14th was a Tuesday. So Tuesday, starting at, so that would have been like Monday night till Tuesday morning, that's your 14th day. At evening, so that means when you're beginning the 15th, which would be Erev, it would be Tuesday night, would begin your evening of the 14th, which means the 14th come to an end, and now the 15th has begun. This is what's called Chag HaMatzot. This is the time period of eating the matzah. It's the same time period you're actually having the Seder. It's the same time period you actually would be eating the lamb. So this is the Torah teaching us about the Pesach in relationship to it. So the Torah tells us, Be'erev tachlu matzot, you shall eat matzah, ad yom echad, from the first day, Eseh l'chodesh Yisraim, ve'esrim l'chodesh be'erev, into the 21st. So that means for a 7-day time period, we're going to have matzah, okay? And we're going to eat the matzah during that time period, okay? So that, remember this, it is a biblical requirement that you must eat matzah for 7 days. A biblical requirement, alright? Kol mechametzit, anything that is leavening, lo yechalu, you shall not eat, bechol meshvatechem, in any of your dwelling places. Moshav literally means any place where we dwell or live or reside, whether it's maybe this year you just happen to be out camping, right? And you decided to have Passover in your tent area. You had to celebrate because of whatever reason, and that's what you're doing. You have to do it in those areas, and the Torah says what? Anything that's leavening. So that means if you're making, let's say, matzah, and your little one decides to go, ooh, that's cool, grabs one, takes it, left it, you realized, oh my gosh, little Moshe decided to grab my little matzah ball and put it over here, and it's been sitting here for like the whole 4 hours. You're going to know that matzah ball's mechametzim, okay? It's mechametzit, it's the Torah says, it's leavening, okay? So what are you going to do with it, alright? What does it say? You get rid of it. Lo tochlu, you shall not eat it, b'chol meshvatechem, in different places, tochlu matzot, you shall eat matzot. So what are you going to do with it? You're going to get rid of it, okay? And what is obviously the way you would get rid of it? Burn it in fire, okay? That's the best way. If it's obviously a Shabbat, right? So let's say you're like, you're in a tent, you're there, and this is what happened to you, you're trying to celebrate Pesach, your son decides that he's got this thing here. You leave the matzah inside your tent, you don't touch it, alright? Nobody eats it. And then once Shabbat's over, get rid of it, okay? So you might sit there and say, wait a second here. Doesn't the Torah say you should not have any leaven in your dwelling places? Let's go back and remember. It says Yom Rishon. It says Tashbitu She'ur. That She'ur, that the She'ur shall cease from your dwelling places. All right. The Torah didn't say that if I had something that became chametz, right? Obviously, I don't want chametz, right? But if it became chametz, see, God is he sees all the possible. He knew that little Moshe would do this, right? He knew that there would be some little Yonah that would do this, or some little, Yocheved that would go and grab this and stuff, right? He knows how we function, right? So he's trying to give us the understanding that he knows that we function as people and have little moments happen and exist, right? So what do? We wait till Shabbat's finally over, and then we would just burn and get rid of the chametz, all right? So we will continue this lesson as we go on to tomorrow, and we continue on learning about the halachot of Pesach, and we will continue carrying on our understanding and learning, as well as understanding what are the prohibitions that we need to stay away from and understand so that we're observing Pesach properly. I'll see you next time.